Hello and welcome to another episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today I'll be conducting a conversation with a conductor I first met 30 years ago, not long after he had won the Leeds conducting competition. He's had a very successful career, holding positions in the UK, Europe and Japan, and he is currently music director of English National Opera. I'm delighted to welcome Martyn Brabbins. Welcome, Martyn. How lovely to speak to you.
You too, Mike.
I want to start, if I may, right at the very beginning. What were your very, very first, earliest musical experiences?
My first, as a youngster, we moved around quite a lot. I think we lived in 4 or 5 places before I was 8. And then when we landed in a place called Towcester, which is spelt Towcester, nothing to do with bread at all. When I joined the school, the primary school there, the mates that I made were all seemed to be members of Towcester Studio Brass Band. So I thought to myself, why not have a go? I asked my mum, would you mind? Because I remember her having quite an antipathy towards the treble recorder, which I fully understand. But she was more than happy for me to go and try the brass band. So yeah, I went and they gave me an instrument. A lovely old guy called William Bell, who seemed from this distance, he seemed to be an ancient gentleman, gave me my first lessons on, I think it was the baritone horn at that point. So I then moved on to the euphonium quite soon after.
And from the euphonium, I read that you then went on to become a trombonist as well.
Yeah, well, I spent all my teens pretty passionate about brass banding. I don't know if you knew or you know anything about brass band, the world itself. It's a very specific world. Much of its energy and attention, and perhaps too much of it, is focused on competitions. And of course, once you start getting quite good, you want to get better, and then you hear other bands that are even better. So you strive to win competitions. And there was a whole cohort of us youngsters that drove the band quite strongly in my teenage years. I went to a very nice comprehensive school in Towcester called the Spon School. We had a lot of musical stuff going on. I sang a lot in choirs. I performed in Gilbert and Sullivan's, and I played the euphonium in the school band and so on. But then when it came to thinking about my future, knowing I was going to talk to you, I do remember my career, having a meeting with a careers advisor, and obviously I was okay at music. I got grade 8 distinction when I was about 13. So, I was obviously, that was something I could do. But the only other thing I could do really was run fast and play rugby. So the careers advisor said, "Oh, why don't you think about the military band, joining a military band?" And I thought, I don't know if that's my thing. And it wasn't to be. I wanted to go and study music seriously because, of course, I did music GCSE, music A level, and then applying to music colleges on the euphonium. I think the Royal Academy would have accepted me as a euphonium player had I wanted to do that, but I really wanted to do a university degree. In order to get into university, I needed to take up the trombone because it was a legitimate orchestral instrument, and again, it wasn't such a huge jolt. The basic thing about brass playing is, there's the technological stuff with your arms and the slide if you're a trombonist, or your fingers if you're a horn player or a trumpet player. But for me to transfer to the trombone wasn't so difficult because it's exactly the same pitch as the euphonium. So the mouthpiece was the same, the length of tubing slightly different, but you got the same end result. So, it took me a while to get the right sort of sound, learn where the positions were on the slide. But yeah, I moved to the trombone when I was about 17, I suppose.
Excuse my ignorance, but it's also the same embouchure as well, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all the same. Yeah, and in fact, we're in a specific time of life at the moment with this coronavirus, and I'm playing the euphonium every day, and I'm loving it.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's great. So tell us, where did you go to university?
I ended up going to Goldsmiths University, University of London, and it's based down in South London in a rather salubrious spot called New Cross. Quite a tough area, I remember. I went to university in 1977, a long, long time ago, and things down there there was a lot of racial strife and tension down in that part of London, Deptford, New Cross. It was a tough area, and it sort of was quite a jolt going from fairly small town in the Midlands down to the big city, and just experience a whole new life. But I must say it was wonderful. I had a great time at Goldsmiths. I spent 3 years as an undergraduate. And I studied the trombone. I had a wonderful teacher called Les Lake, who was bass trombonist in the English National Opera Orchestra, which of course is quite significant to me these days. And I loved the academic side. I also studied composition, and after graduating, I had a couple of options. I auditioned for what was a thing that was actually based at Goldsmiths called the National Centre for Orchestral Studies, which was a 1-year postgraduate course where you just played in an orchestra, funded student orchestra. A wonderful thing. My wife actually did that course. I got a place and decided I didn't really see my future purely as a trombone player. So I didn't take up the place. I did, though, do a 2-year postgraduate master's in composition, which I loved. I thought at that point maybe that was where I was destined to go, but that also wasn't to be. And then in 1982, when that all finished, I was out in the wide world of London music making as a freelance player, playing trombone and euphonium, teaching brass for the ILEA and the London Education Authority and for Croydon, and conducting a little bit. I must say, I'd always had a little bit of a passion for conducting, and it gradually emerged like a very reluctant flower budding. It was something that I always wanted to do really strongly, but never really had the confidence to do it. But it started after I graduated. I started doing a few things.
I was wondering when the conducting would appear. It seems that it was something that was bubbling away in the background, and then sort of slowly started to take over.
Yeah, I wonder whether with most people things like that emerge. I didn't, as a teenager, there was no way I thought I'm going to be a conductor, but it was something that I was fascinated by. Even in the brass band, we had a wonderful main conductor. It was William Scholes, his name was. He was a Salvation Army musician, and he was extraordinary. I still remember the things he said, to me about how you get players to do things and how you make a crescendo work. If you see a crescendo, you just play a bit quieter, and things, lots of things. And he would use phrases like, just a fag paper gap between those two notes. I can remember so much from that guy from all those years ago. And then, it kind of emerged. I suppose I felt that I didn't have the right credentials as a brass band boy, as a, working class background. I saw myself not in I saw other young conductors out there and saw the routes that they'd taken to get to where they got to. And I thought, that's not necessarily, I'm a bit of a square peg in a round hole. But, I started doing a bit. The first paid conducting I did, and I must tell you about this, was every Wednesday afternoon, I would catch the train from Waterloo down to Claygate, which is somewhere down, Surrey-ish. And I conducted the Claygate Towns Women's Guild Choir for 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon. And it was people by sweet elderly ladies. I remember the secretary, she used to write out little paying chits for me. Her name was Doris Smith, and I still remember that really fondly. And it was quite instructive. You know, if you can make something happen with, I know there were only about 15 of them on a good day. If you can make something happen from those, you know, if that was your source material, then perhaps you had a chance of making other more able people create something too. So yeah, there was that, and I conducted, I think for about 2 years, the El Dorado Operatic Society.
Oh, what a wonderful name.
Yeah, we did South Pacific, we did Fiddler on the Roof, and Karen, my wife, was the fiddler. We did Half a Sixpence. So, you know, I did lots of that kind of stuff. And the brass band didn't disappear. The conductor that I mentioned earlier, William Scholes, retired. And I was probably about 23 or something, 22, 23. And I went and conducted the band that I was a player in in my school days. So I used to catch the train up to Milton Keynes or wherever, and get a lift up to Towcester every Tuesday and Friday night. Where I had two smashing years with them. Again, you gain so much experience of you know, how to make things happen, and yeah, on it went.
So what took you from being the conductor of the band in Towcester to St. Petersburg, or Leningrad maybe as it was then, and studying with Ilya Musin?
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? What a journey. What happened? Well, I carried on, you know, conducting bands and conducting little bits and pieces and teaching, playing, composing, and sort of getting frustrated. You know, there was a sense of frustration all the time. And I remember Karen and I got married in 1985. We were very, you know, happily comfortable. Karen had a nice job. I was busy as a freelancer, and financially everything was fine. But I was there was this frustration. Karen and I used to go to concerts all the time, and I'd always sit behind the orchestra watching the conductor. And, you know, it was something it became something I had to do. So there came a moment, I remember we were driving back from having spent a couple of days on the south coast somewhere. And I said to Karen, this has got to stop. I've got to do something. I've got to do one thing properly. Be it conducting, then great. So I applied for 3 things at that point. I applied for a British Council scholarship to go and study in Leningrad. I applied for a teacher training course, and I applied to be assistant head of music at St. Paul's Girls' School, assistant to Hilary Davin-Wetton at the time. So as luck would have it, I was offered all 3. So obviously I took the scholarship to Leningrad. That partly was inspired by Sian Edwards, who I knew. I'd played in various little orchestras that she put together and conducted. And I got to know Sian a little bit, and she said to me at one point, well, why don't you, you know, do what I did? I must have called her and said, look, I'm frustrated as can be. What do I do? And yeah, that's how it happened. British Council, thank goodness, came up trumps. And in 1986, September 86, I went off to Leningrad with lots of clothes, warm clothes, a few scores, and a very, very basic knowledge and skill of conducting, which Musin quickly found out I had a very basic knowledge and skill, and got me, really took me back to the beginning and worked with me for a year. I had a lot of fantastic opportunities while I was there, but the biggest of which came towards the end of my first year. I was asked by Valery Gergiev if I would assist him the following autumn, at the Kirov on a production of Don Giovanni. So I applied for a second year of scholarship, and luckily that came up too. So I spent 2 incredible years in Russia. living in that society, surrounded by those incredible musicians, but also experiencing, the hardship of the winters, the lack of produce in the shops, the hardship of life generally, which we in the relatively pampered West certainly didn't understand at that point. It was extraordinary 2 years, and it changed my life.
So can you give us an insight into how Musin taught, what he taught you? I mean, amongst us conductors, there are probably two great teachers in Europe, at least in the 20th century. It's Ilja Musin and from Finland, Jorma Panula. So what was Musin like?
Well, he was, as a human being, he was very, very humble, very gentle, extraordinarily wise and intelligent, widely read, and quite old. So he had a lot of experience. He enrolled at the conservatoire the same time as Shostakovich, in the same, he was in the same queue lining up to enroll.
Wow.
He was at the premiere of the first symphony of Shostakovich, which Shostakovich wrote as a graduation exercise. He was in the first, him and Yevgeny Mravinsky, who of course conducted the Leningrad Philharmonic for 50 years.
Yeah.
He and Musin were the first two students of Nikolai Malko. So when the class in Leningrad was established by Malko, they were the first two students. So Musin had this extraordinary wealth of experience of life and hardship. I mean, he was Jewish and certainly wasn't looked favorably on for, big conducting jobs or what have you. He had a very traumatic wartime experience where he was chief conductor in Minsk, in Belarusia, which was absolutely decimated by the German advance. And he and his wife got separated and walked to Moscow, which is something like, 800 or 900 kilometers. He'd experienced such an incredible life. But as a teacher, he also had, when I got there, he already had about 50 years of teaching experience. He was in his mid-80s when I got there. Still quite healthy, although he had a weak heart. He would go off every now and again for a week of rest and respite. How did he teach? Well, he was very methodical, with baton technique and the process through which he taught. So I spent my first few weeks conducting in front of a mirror to no sound with one of his assistants, just getting me to be able to conduct a beautiful legato in all different beating patterns. Then he taught me his famous circles, which I use in my own teaching when I get the opportunity, which is something very specific to Musin. He taught me a special way of using the wrist in faster music. And then he would get one of the pianists. There were two pianists in the class to play orchestral scores. I got, for about 3 or 4 days, I had half an hour with one of the pianists, and she would just be playing very simple 4-bar phrases, and Musin would be getting me to conduct these things so that the actual beat connected to the sound that one heard, that was played. So you weren't just conducting black dots on a white page, you were actually connecting the gesture to the sound. And that was the most amazing thing about his teaching, that after a while you got to feel the sound of the orchestra in your gestures. So we moved on to repertoire. It went, you can imagine, it just started with things like Haydn, Mozart, early Beethoven, and that would be for a few months. And then I progressed maybe a Weber overture, and it was all a very, very structured list of repertoire, which he listed for year 1 of study, you do these pieces, for year 2, and so on. And at the end of my first year, one of the amazing things about that course was there was an orchestra in the conservatoire, a professional orchestra made up of, maybe the odd alcoholic, the odd political dissident, some younger players, a rough and ready kind of orchestra. But they were there, I think it was probably 3 mornings each week for the conducting faculty to be let loose on. And over the course of that first year, I conducted them regularly. I never spoke to them, or hardly ever, apart from a good morning. Musin said, no, you don't talk. You do everything with your hands.
Oh, that's
so
wonderful.
You don't, yeah, it was amazing. He wouldn't let you stop and rehearse. If it went wrong, you did it again, but you then did it right so that so they did it right.
Yeah.
And I have to say that principle is a golden rule for me. If something's wrong in a rehearsal, very often, not always, of course, very often it's the conductor has caused that problem.
Yeah.
And that stemmed very much from that early lesson with Musin. He said, if you conduct well, they'll play well. And I stuck with that. I stick with that rule to this very day. But at the end of my first year there, which was, I remember it I still remember every May the 14th, I remember, because it was May the 14th, 1987, I conducted a performance of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony with the orchestra. So it was the end of year concert for the foreign conductors. And I got the big slice of the cake. And that was the moment where it all kind of started to fall into place.
You come back from Leningrad and back to the UK, and the next thing that pops up on your CV is a competition. And you said earlier on that you're not too sure about competitions in music, but you won the Leeds conducting competition. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a couple of weeks after I got back from Russia. It was extraordinary timing. It was a very intense period. Of course, I knew I'd been accepted on the competition while I was still in Russia. So Musin kindly went through various bits of the repertoire. I remember us going through Beethoven 5. We went through Dvorak's symphonic variations. We went through the Bartok dance suite. So he helped me prepare as much as he was able, without, this was in his living room at home, I remember, but we went through these things. And then, I went up to Leeds, and it was kind of all a bit hazy. I remember I stayed in some bed and breakfast up the street there and wandered down every day and did my bit with the amazing orchestra from Opera North. And there was Charles Groves and David Lloyd-Jones and a couple of other folk on the panel, and you hoped you'd done enough to get through. And at the end of the day, you'd sit down in this little room and they'd announce who went through to the next round, and so on it went. And then there was the final, and I think there were 4 of us in the final. And I have to say, I rather felt at the time I'd drawn the short straw. There was a Tchaikovsky, The Tempest, I think. There was Firebird Suite. There was something else, which I can't remember. And then I had this, as I mentioned earlier, the symphonic variations of Dvorak, which, if you know it, is kind of, I know, is it 28 variations and a fugue? I mean, it's it's surreal. So
yeah, it's a big old piece, quite rambling piece.
It rambles, and it's got so many different gear changes and tempo changes and variations, and I was absolutely gung-ho, and I'd committed it to memory, and I did it from memory in the final, and it went pretty well. But it's not a flashy piece, so I was expecting the worst, but thank goodness I came out on top. And from that moment, a career is nowhere near guaranteed, but at least you've got a pretty good kick up the backside to get you started. And there's a cash prize. There were invitations to, I don't know, 8 or 10 orchestras probably. And as you very well know, if you do okay and they like you, that's how you'll develop a career, because you'll get asked back. So yeah.
And so you're out there now in the big wide world with guest conducting engagements and commitments. At any stage, are you thinking now about being a music director somewhere, or are you just happy getting out there, forging a career, getting your diary filled up with work? Is that what you were thinking, or did you already think, do you know what, I'd love to be a music director somewhere?
No, it's not my way. I'm afraid. I couldn't have, I was sort of grinning all over my face just being out there as a conductor, and there was very little thought into progress or journey. It was quite slow, I must say, getting going, and I have no problem with that. I mean, I was quite a late starter. I was 28 or 29 when I won the competition, so that's quite old in these days of young conductors.
That's very true.
But yeah, but you know, I was really happy just to forge a steady way forward and make mistakes in private. And you will have experienced some of those as leader of the Kent County Youth Orchestra in one of my early concerts that
I remember
engagements.
it very, very well, but very, very fondly actually as well. It was a really good week, and I remember the first time I played for you in the profession, bouncing up to you and saying, "Do you remember me?" And fortunately, you did. But yeah, I remember that week with my county youth orchestra incredibly fondly.
Yeah, and I did Kent, I did Sheffield, I did a few other youth orchestras, and you really can get to learn repertoire, and you can begin to understand how things work. One of the early big, I suppose I'll call it a big break, was to get to conduct the BBC Scottish. I say that it was a big opportunity because I still conduct them. This is 28 years later or something. So for me, that relationship with that orchestra has been a thread of pure gold through my whole life. One of the guys in the marketing team a couple of years ago came up to me with a list of pieces I'd done with them. It's over 1,000 pieces.
My God! Wow, that's
Yes.
amazing.
So that's where I've really learnt what I've learnt more with them than with any other way throughout over the years. So I'm incredibly grateful to them. People have often asked me about ambition over the years. I just want to do things better with great musicians and great orchestras and so on. The one ambition I suppose I would have is to conduct more Wagner. So maybe that it might be possible as music director for an opera house. One will see.
So you were principal guest conductor with the Royal Flemish Philharmonic, but also music director with the Nagoya Philharmonic in Japan. What can you tell us about the differences between playing, mindset, attitude between those orchestras?
That is an interesting cultural question. Japanese orchestras are very, very specific. I've conducted a few now. I mean, I love them. They're incredibly disciplined. You turn up to the first rehearsal and basically they play everything that's there, especially the fiddle players. It's extraordinary. The other great thing about Japanese orchestras, in a sense, again, as I would say specifically the strings, is that they all play in a very, very similar way. They're all schooled in a certain style, which can be very beneficial to ensemble and to phrasing and articulation. It's the same. People ask me about Russian orchestras. Sorry to digress, but people ask me, what makes them special? And I think, again, it's because most of those string players will have learnt that Russian style, Russian school of playing, and that's what gets that rich string sound. Whereas with a European orchestra like the Royal Flemish, they've got amazing strengths as well, but they're made up, I think the Royal Flemish, I'm not exaggerating, have about 20 different nationalities in the orchestra, including Japanese, but also including Russians, British, American, Bulgarians, Romanians, French, you name it. So there's a different attitude to, there's not a corporate attitude. You can tell a joke to a British orchestra and everyone will understand. You tell a joke in Antwerp and, half of them, 3/4 of them haven't got a clue what you're talking about. So, but the other big difference about chief guest to music director, of course, is there's a much greater responsibility as music director in artistic planning, pastoral care with the musicians, just contact with the musicians, contact with the media, the public. It's a bigger challenge altogether. And that was interesting in Japan. They're a wonderful orchestra, wonderful group of people, interesting management. I mean, I was flabbergasted to find, because they're sponsored by Toyota, that some of their higher management people were Toyota employees, kind of checking. I mean, this isn't probably not how you best to phrase it, kind of checking the Toyota's money was being spent in the right way. It was unbelievable to me to think that an orchestra could be set up in that way, but that's quite common in Japan. So yeah, there were many challenges to rise to, but it was working in Japan. I find fantastic. I go back to an orchestra in Tokyo, and I go back to Nagoya, of course, most years, and there's something about the culture and the audiences which is so special. I was there in Tokyo in the autumn, and we did a program. No, it was in January actually. We did a program of Ravel, Macmillan, and Elgar, and the hall was full, absolutely full. You couldn't get a seat for love nor money, and the audience were really so warm and supportive and quietly attentive. But then when the music finishes, wow, they let you know they've had a good time.
You were lucky enough, or maybe you'll contradict me, to be the conductor of the 6th live performance of Havergal Brian's Gothic Symphony. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about how that was to put that monster of a piece together.
Oh gosh, no, I do feel lucky to have done that. It was a totally memorable experience, not just the performance, but the whole journey to get there. I mean, so we ended up with 990 performers in the Albert Hall.
You couldn't find 10 more.
We did. We had them, but there was sickness. We hoped for 1,000, but it didn't quite. So, yeah, you can just think about any piece that's got that number of performers in it, and you can imagine the logistical struggle we had putting it together. So, the most fortunate thing in the process was that we had a producer of the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, who were one of the 2 orchestras, the other being the BBC Concert Orchestra, who had been involved in a performance before. Now, that proved invaluable. He kind of knew where all the logistical problems were. And I remember spending several hours with a few guys putting together a plan of action. How many choruses would we need? Well, it ended up with 6 symphonic choruses. How many children's choruses would we need? Well, it ended up with 2, one of whom was the CBSO Youth Chorus, as you're connected. Soloists were it was just 4 soloists, but the 2 orchestras in themselves, that's already quite a number of musicians, were not sufficient to fill all the seats. I mean, there were 11 clarinet parts, for instance. So, there were 4 offstage brass bands with timps in each one of them, which were in the Albert Hall were sort of on the side stalls here, to my 2 on one side, 2 on the other. There was an offstage trumpet choir of I think 9 players that played for about 20 seconds. They were up in the balcony, up above the organ. There was an offstage bit of soprano and on-stage soprano. There was organ. It just went on and on. So the choruses, how do they rehearse? They all rehearsed individually. I mean, the parts, it was split into 2 choirs by Havergal Brian, but then it's multi-divisi within those choirs. I think at some points there's something like 48 individual parts going on in the choruses. They all rehearsed it separately. And then again, Birmingham features, I remember having a day in the town hall with 2 amplified pianos on stage, me, a number of chorus masters, I can't remember how many, and the 500 or so choristers, to try and mold the thing into some kind of shape. The orchestras we rehearsed in Cardiff. We managed to rehearse some of it in the studio of the BBC, but then when we put the whole thing together for part 2, just the orchestras, we had to go to a much, much bigger venue in Cardiff. Then we all decamped to London. We had rehearsals in Alexandra Palace, which is in Wood Green, North London. Massive, massive spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had we had Tutti Orchestra. Then we had Tutti with the choruses and the soloists. And finally, we had a couple of sessions in the Albert Hall to try and get this thing into some kind of shape. Part one is okay in that it's purely orchestral, but the biggest part of the piece, the second part, with all the forces, we didn't get really to play it through in one go. We didn't have the time to do a run through, simply because it was so complicated getting things together. I mean, you know, you can imagine how far away from me some of those people were. But then the performance came. It sold. I remember the concert sold out in 2 hours, and it was packed. It was packed with musicians, of course, and I think, you know, one thing I love about concerts and quiet endings is the silence you get at the end of a concert. And I think we had 35 seconds of silence at the end of that one. And it's one of the absolutely memorable feeling of going through this tumultuous 2 hours of music making and ending up with this extraordinary silence, which then erupted into cacophonous, you know, uproarious applause. And it was, yeah, it was an amazing, amazing night, not to be forgotten by, actually, probably for most people, players I come across still talk about it if they were involved. Yes, that was something else. I mean, I suppose, going back to ambition, my other ambition would be to conduct that piece again and be the only conductor ever to conduct it twice.
So in 2016, you became the music director of English National Opera, and so you've been there now 4 years. Have you enjoyed it?
Oh, it's amazing. I love being music director of ENO. I mean, it's just an extraordinary group of people, from, you know, the wig makers through to the makeup artists, the stage management through to the amazing orchestra and chorus. We have over 4 years, you get to know people, you get to feel part of an extraordinarily passionate and brilliant team, and to feel, you know, that when you're in the pit there, that you're leading these amazing performances that they put on. It's extraordinary. It has its challenges, as everybody that knows anything about English National Opera will know. But I think every opera company in the world has extra challenges, which you know, we live to face those challenges. And currently we're in one at the moment. You know, we've had to cancel several performances. I had 5 more performances of Butterfly to do when the theatres closed. We'd done the first night of an amazing new production of Figaro, so 6 or 7 performances, that cancelled. And there was a beautiful Rusalka in the making, which didn't even get to the stage. So, that in itself is heartbreaking.
Such a shame. Yeah, real shame. When you come to learn a new score, are you the sort of conductor who goes through it methodically, writes an awful lot of things in the score, or do you go to the piano and learn it at the piano and then rather keep your scores clean?
I'm not much of a pianist, so that doesn't really help me. I do a little bit of work at the piano. Scores I read through initially and with a pencil, just a 3B Mitsubishi special I pick up in Japan. I don't mark my scores very much. I find it distracting, especially colours and goodness knows what. They would put me off in performance. I read through, I sit on trains and read scores and look at scores, and people look at me and think I'm some kind of strange person, but, well, they're probably right. You know, I use my traveling time to learn scores. I'm a voracious score learner. I love learning scores, and the more I conduct, the kind of more efficient I am at it. So it's something that is second nature to me now, to be able to read scores and imagine what's going on. Even, you know, I conduct quite a few premieres and can get to the the nub of things. I put a bit of that down to the fact that I'm very sympathetic because I trained as a composer. I know the pain they all go through, and I listen to recordings. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit that. I know some might be. No, I listen widely. I don't listen to one recording over and over. That would be fatal. One thing I do enjoy listening to, so when I come back to Tchaik 5, like I did the other day, in the past, although I didn't do it this time, I've gone back and listened to my own performances of it, which have been broadcast on the BBC, and I can, you know, get copies of. I find that fascinating because you feel when you're conducting something, oh yeah, that was okay, you know, that corner went quite well, and then you listen back and you then realize, oh no, I microscopically, because, you know, I don't think people quite realize how precise tempo is. If you're out by 1%, you may as well be out by 25%. So that's when those recordings of your own performances can be so revealing, because you think you've done it in one way, but when you're actually doing it, you're involved in doing it, and that means your ears are not quite as free as when you're just listening to something. So yeah, that can be a fascinating learning tool, especially tempos. You know, tempo is usually okay, but it's the corners. When you're turning corners, do you do it just right? Do you make the transitions work really in the way you want? So that can be fascinating.
I've seen an interview where one conductor, it was Pavloyevi actually, says that not listening to recordings is a foolish way forwards. If all of these recordings now and videos and YouTube and Spotify, they're all there, and you should listen to as many recordings as possible when learning a new piece, because you hear how other people do it, you hear rights, you hear wrongs, you form opinions. And then another conductor, Simon Rattle, said he listens to it very, very early in the learning process and very late, and then maybe even after he's performed it as somebody else's performance. This snobbish premise that some people have, oh, no, I would never listen to another person's performance before I learn the score. It seems to be rather cutting their own noses off to spite their face.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think there's everything to be gained by listening and experiencing, you know, other ways of doing it. It doesn't mean saying at all that you're going to do it that way.
No.
But it can teach you so much. And there's, you know, I love watching people like Abado. You just see this kind of the spiritual nature that he gets in it. And who's the old Swedish guy?
Oh, Herbert Blomstedt.
Herbert Blomstedt. I mean, it's like a religious experience that he goes through, and the way he creates an aura. You know, there's something about conductors that has to create something more than just, you know, the obvious stuff. And it's amazing. One doesn't emulate how they do it, but it's amazing to see what these people do and how one's personality is incredibly important in what the performance is and how the performers respond to you as a conductor.
You are a visiting professor at the Royal College of Music in conducting. Do you enjoy teaching? If so, is your teaching influenced at all by your experiences with Ilya Musin, or is it a mixture of that and then your experiences of being a conductor?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. Obviously, one has to put one's own way of doing things. I'm not Musin, so I approach it very differently to him, and I don't teach in the long process way that he does. I just don't have time to do that. So yeah, I put my own way of doing it, but it's all influenced. Everything I do as a conductor really has at the background the Musin principles. So I do try and use those. I mean, I did teach on a conducting summer school in Orkney for 10 or 12 years, a 2-week thing that I founded this course. And that was incredibly rewarding because we had 8 students each year, and you really, it's just following on from what I said about conductors having a certain personality or aura or presence. You need really to, in order to teach someone to conduct, you need to know them as a person. You need to know how they tick. You need to know what hang-ups they have a little bit, or where their strengths are, or what might need curbing, what might need exaggerating. And over that 2-week period in Orkney, we used to really get to know one another, because you're captive in Orkney. There's not much to do.
No.
And it was a very intensive course. We had 6 hours a day minimum of teaching, and we really got to the heart of certain people, and I think in a positive way. So yeah, as much as I do have a hang up about technique, I think technique has to be addressed. You can't stand in front of an orchestra as a conductor, in my opinion. You're being disrespectful to Mike Seal, for instance, who started playing the violin aged 5 or 6, spent all those years playing hours and hours and hours, finally gets into the CBSO, and conductors turn up with having spent a couple of years maybe as a student conductor. When you're a youngster, you're a kindergarten conductor if you're 20, whereas as a violinist, if you're 20 and you've been playing for 15 years, you really know your way around the instrument and music. So conductors, we're always playing catch up to get to the level of understanding and technique and musicianship and corporate playing and understanding of psychology and all the things we need to do as conductors. We're always playing catch up, and only in the last couple of years, honestly, can I really feel now I sort of know what I'm doing. I've caught up. I've put in those years and I've caught up, and it's quite a nice feeling, I have to say. So yeah, I do love teaching. I lament the fact that I don't have enough time to teach, and I'm really thrilled that the Royal College of Music, partly influenced by some conversations I had with the people there, that they've just appointed a new head of conducting, and I think things are going to take on a more structured and vibrant way forward. And it's wonderful to be involved. I love going in there, conducting the orchestras, having the master's students alongside and working with them. Working with these young musicians is invigorating and inspiring. I love it, absolutely love it.
So, Martyn, every conductor will be asked the same 10 questions at the end of the podcast. So let's start. What sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
Birdsong, I love. I'm surrounded by birds here in the country. And music, I hate as a concept. Music in the background.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
Oh gosh. Being with my family.
Who would be your favourite conductor of yesteryear?
The one I admire the most probably is Carlos Kleiber. And the one who's influenced me the most would have to be Ilya Musin.
And who would be a favourite current conductor?
Andris Nelson's. I love what he does and how he does it.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
Oh dear, that's really tricky. I mean, I suppose since we talked about it earlier, the Gothic is tricky. Pli Selon Pli, Boulez.
Yeah, that's hard.
Really complex piece. And Mozart.
Because of its beauty and simplicity.
Because of its perfection.
Yeah.
Because it's perfect. I mean, as a conductor, I'm always terrified about serving the music adequately. And I think Mozart, I find the hardest to get close enough to.
When travelling abroad to conduct, what item or items could you not leave home without?
Funnily enough, it's just twice this has come up today. I don't know why, or how it started, but for many, many years, 30 more, 40 years, I've made tapestries. So I currently take with me always a bit of tapestry canvas, some wool, various colours, and some needles and a tiny pair of scissors. And I get home from rehearsal or whatever, and I sit and create stuff, colourful patterns, and sometimes it's random shapes, sometimes it's very mathematical and geometrical shapes. And yeah, it's something I've done forever, and it's something I really value when I'm away from home on my own. It's something I can sit and do, and it's kind of a bit of art therapy, but it's creative and you're making something.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
From my own personal conducting life, I spent too much time away from home when my children were young.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I got a serious answer and a silly answer. I mean, given what's going on now, my wife's had fairly major brain surgery. I have such admiration for doctors and the medical profession generally. Not saying I would have been able to be, but it's a profession that I have the utmost respect for. And the other silly one, which I've often said, when I wished I wasn't going away, look, I could always be a milkman. Because when I was a boy, my older brother had a milk round. I used to get up early and help him sometimes. I have no problem with getting up early in the morning. I love early mornings. I love the quiet, the peace. Yeah, so milkman or a doctor.
Brilliant. And finally, if the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Oh gosh, drink's easy. I'd have one of my own whiskies. My uncle and I bought a barrel of Springbank in 1996, and it's subsequently been bottled when it was 16 years old. And I've got several bottles stashed away in my attic. It'd be one of those as a drink. Meal, something Japanese. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a great fan of Japanese food, but yeah, I can't be specific. I'm not that specific about my culinary tastes.
But a Japanese meal with whiskey is definitely something that the Japanese would appreciate, so I don't see why you shouldn't appreciate it.
Exactly.
What an absolute pleasure, Martyn. It's been great to talk to you. I hope to see you again very, very soon.
And you, Michael. It's been wonderful being able to share these thoughts with you, and I hope some people have a good laugh and enjoy hearing what we've been talking about.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, and with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat to a conductor who has conducted pretty much every orchestra in the UK and has an extremely busy career. He also has his very own orchestra, an orchestra that has had a huge global following ever since they made their debut at the BBC Proms in 2009. Until then, bye bye!